Welcome. I am Sister Who. Today I just wanted to offer some reflections on the question word which is one of the words that appears in the introduction to the show. This is the show where we deal with issues of life and spirituality and all the questions, which is why in the introduction to the show we put together this montage of questions, all the different questions we can ask and how all of them can lead to something constructive, to new insight, to growth, to empowerment, to different understandings, ways of being, maybe the ability to collaborate with someone that we would have previously considered to be an adversary. But once we come to understand a little bit more, we actually find we can work together in spite of our differences. In any case, when we first, it seems like such a simple word, which, just a little five-letter question word. It has some rather marvelous dimensions, repercussions, ways that it can lead to all sorts of much bigger and even profound subjects and discussions. Probably the most obvious of the various questions that comes through the word which is when people begin to ask which is right or wrong, so that the word which takes on a moral implication, that somehow it's the question word that stands between us and being good and being bad. That if I do this or if I do that, which do I choose? Well, which is the right choice? The interesting thing, as you consider the complexity and the dimensions of each choice, is that very often the majority of choices in life come back to being in this gray area in the middle. It's not a black and white choice, as the saying goes. In old Hollywood movies, the bad guys always wore black hats and the good cowboys always wore white hats, and that's how you could tell who the good guys were and who the bad guys were. Well, if somebody walked in with a gray hat, it would have been very confusing. It does seem to me, however, that most of our choices in life are in that potentially confusing gray middle area, where we need to learn discernment so that we can make what some people call judgment calls. Something that is not inherently right or wrong, but you have to make a decision which way to go, because you don't know. There's some good things about the bad choice, and there's some bad things about the good choice, and neither choice is completely good or completely bad, but it's always a mix. Most of life, it seems, is a mix, where, well, political elections, I suppose, being one example of how often people have described political elections as a choice between the lesser of two evils, because the really good candidates aren't even running. But that's a whole nother show for another discussion another time. When we ask the question which, initially it may say to us, which is the right choice? And as we begin to look at the pieces and the parts and what constitutes each of the choices, it may become very difficult to decide which is the right choice, because in some ways they're both right, in some ways they're both wrong. And maybe what the question word which is really pointing us to is the need for a third option, for finding a new possibility that is not represented by either of the ones in front of us. Maybe in a particular election there are two primary candidates and neither of them seem particularly desirable. What we really want is a third candidate that embodies qualities that would better serve the office being decided by the election. There's not always a person available with those qualities who's willing to step forward and do the office, though. And of course, the complication in that is how everything is so interconnected, that if you had a genuinely good person, would they be able to survive the complex gray areas of the office? Because most of our political offices require an inordinate number of judgment calls, where any choice you make is not completely good or completely bad. It's just, but a choice has to be made. And no matter what choice you make, somebody will agree with you and think you're wonderful, and somebody will disagree with you and think you should be thrown out of office and replaced by somebody else. And in the midst of that intense crossfire, I can understand where it would be very difficult to remain a person of integrity, of clarity, of conviction, of personal virtue. And so, like most things in life, I suppose, it takes a special kind of person to do each special kind of job. It takes a special kind of person to deal with the complexities of government and to live in this crossfire where there's lots of questions but none with really conclusive answers, because each one has certain benefits and also has certain consequences. And it's difficult, but not impossible, I don't think, but it is very difficult to find the answers that are beneficial to all persons concerned, where there don't have to be any losers, because everybody is a winner by the way the choice is made, by the way the problem is resolved. That it's not resolved at the expense of someone else, but it's resolved in a way that everyone wins. Another thing that comes with the question word which, that I suppose we've been kind of alluding to with these side comments about political situations and people working together, is this pragmatic, practical aspect of questions of possible alliances. That when you decide who your teammates are going to be, which person do I pick? With which cause do I align myself? Which charity does does a certain portion of my money that I want to give to charitable causes go? Which charitable organization? In choosing which one, there's a sense in which you unavoidably create some sort of alliance, that this person is my teammate, this is a cause I support, and suddenly, in the eyes of the world around us, or in the eyes of society, that cause, its leadership, somehow becomes part of how people define ourselves. That if for example, if I spent a day working with a nonprofit organization that deals with ecological concerns in an extreme way, doing confrontational demonstrations and such. If that was the sort of demonstration in which I participated, how the public sees that organization would begin to be a little bit, at least, of how they see me. Well, you were with them, you're supporting them, so obviously you must agree with them to some extent. That makes the choice of which rather complicated, because in some cases we want to support a cause, but sometimes the way the people involved in that cause are going about it is not the way we would go about it if we were the ones calling the shots and making the decisions for that organization. If, for example, someone in a third world country is noticing that their country is very oppressed by wealthier countries, and they have tried all the usual avenues of trying to get people's attention to this problem, and saying, my people are hurting, won't somebody help them? And nobody does anything. At that point, they have a choice of which way they're going to go. Are they going to accept that it's a problem that's not going away, oppression is here until some greater force, some solidarity of the people or something can successfully stand against it? Or they could say, I'll make the other choice, as some have. Personally, I believe violence is always the wrong answer, but I understand that when you get to a point of frustration and you ask yourself, which path shall I choose, the path of peace or the path of violence? Some people choose the path of violence because of how frustrated they feel and how essential it feels to do something to draw attention to the problem. The complication of resorting to violence, of course, is that it sometimes creates a backlash and doesn't generally help the cause anyway. It draws attention to them, and it may draw attention to their cause, but it doesn't create, in my opinion, it doesn't create motivation in those who can help to help. It instead creates defensiveness. Suddenly they're not looking at your country that you're trying to draw attention to. They're looking at you as the perpetrator of violence. And so in a way, the person who has resorted to violence in order, hoping to draw attention to their country's problems, is instead becoming the distraction from other people looking at their country's problems and addressing the problems about which they're so concerned. Instead, all attention shifts to dealing with acts of violence and with terrorism, instead of dealing with the human concerns behind all of that, the concerns that are not being effectively addressed, and consequently pushing more and more people to desperate actions to draw attention to the plight of their people. If we did a better job of taking care of each other, hopefully, not entirely, but hopefully it would at least radically decrease the number of such instances, because we wouldn't wind up with people feeling so frustrated. But this is, again, the question of which. Which are we going to do? Are we going to act from frustration? Are we going to act from anger? Are we going to act from peace, love, compassion? Which way is it going to be? And which will it be? Will we have the patience to wait for a peaceful solution to come, even though it may take longer? Or will we have the impatience sufficient to resort to more drastic measures because there isn't time to wait for some people? And unfortunately, and I don't mean to minimize this, it's a tragedy, and it's a common, frequent tragedy within human history, but it is no less a tragedy just because it's common. And that is that again and again and again, when people have attempted to address problems, things with their societies, with their governments that are being oppressive, and they want them to stop, in virtually every case, people have to die before enough, well, as I put it, before discontent reaches critical mass. Until it's like in virtually any city across the country. There, time and time again, if there is a car accident at a particular intersection, the next step is to put up a stop sign. Until there is a car accident, if someone feels there should be a stop sign there, it may be a lengthy argument with their elected officials saying, I want a stop sign on that corner. I want a stop sign on that corner. I want a stop sign on that corner. Why is it so difficult to have a stop sign on that corner? And they get nowhere until there's a car accident and someone gets killed. And the next day, there's a stop sign on the corner. Why do we keep pushing ourselves to such extremes? I don't know. It's disappointing, but it seems to be a well-established precedent that will probably continue. When I say it's about discontent reaching critical mass, I mean it's when enough people get discontent that the balance of discontent rises higher than the level of apathy. The amount of discontent is more than the number of people saying, don't get involved, I'm too busy, I don't have the time, I don't have money to deal with it. When discontent reaches a certain amount, the money will be found, the organization will happen, and the problem will be resolved. But until the discontent reaches that level, it's so difficult to get anything done and to make anything happen. Leaving us with the question of which way am I going to commit myself? Am I going to commit myself to peace because the path of violence has long-term effects that are even more destructive than the present situation? Or am I going to be impatient, demand an answer now, and resort to violence in order to draw attention, I think, to a problem? But of course it doesn't usually draw attention to the problem. Violence draws attention to itself, not to what prompted it. So in a sense, violence is always blinding. It takes us away from the decision of which and allows us to see only one thing, really, and short circuits and obstructs our ability to see the other possibilities, to embrace the question word which, and to realize that there are other options, that there are ways of caring, of loving, of listening, of being present, of taking the initiative before it grows into a big problem, before somebody dies, before somebody gets hurt. And taking, which would you rather have? Waiting until there's a funeral scheduled on your weekly calendar that you're now going to attend, or having years of memories you could continue to make with that person as you work collaboratively to make a better community for everyone, for yourselves, for both of the individuals involved, and for everybody around you, for your families, for your children and grandchildren, for all of your friends. Very much at the heart of the question word which is this matter of choice. Some people don't want choices because they want that right or wrong choice, and they want someone to tell them what the right or wrong choice is. And the more you understand a choice, the less you believe that there is an inherently right or wrong choice. There are people who will be affected one way, people who will be affected another. Beginning with yourself, but also to everyone around you also. Even when I'm hiking in the wilderness and I come to a fork in the trail and I get to decide which of the two paths I will follow, I have no way of knowing how much is riding on that decision. That if I take the path to the right, I will meet some along the trail and we will have a conversation that may change that person's life. If I take the other trail, I will meet someone along that trail and we will have a conversation, and it may change that person's life. That each of those people will, in either scenario, then will return to the world in which they live, and because of what they have learned or not, will make certain other decisions and have certain other effects. So that the long-term effect of that conversation along the trail is almost impossible to predict, because it could affect, each time that person talks with or affects another person, it goes one more step. And if that person talks to two people, then it goes more. And by the time you follow this out, several conversations, you're now dealing with dozens, perhaps hundreds of people being affected by that one little conversation. None of which I would be aware of. I would simply have participated in that conversation, and then I go on my way, not have any idea what the ultimate effect of my words will be. Trying to make sure that the words I've shared with that person are the most insightful and inspirational and helpful possible. But ultimately having to trust the divine or humanity or something bigger than myself with what the ultimate effect of my humble offering of some words of encouragement and insight might be. Another whole dimension of the question word which is the question of timing. Which is the right thing to do now? Which is the right thing to do later? There's a way in which paths of life converge, and to say which is the right or which is the wrong path is so drastically oversimplifying it. There's, what would be a good metaphor? Perhaps the choice, when I was finishing high school, I found it absolutely ridiculous even at that point. Because even then I understood something of the implications, I think. When the guidance counselor at my high school and various teachers would ask, so what do you want to do with your life? And I kind of thought to myself, at 17 years old, I'm supposed to know? I had no idea. All I had known really at that point was the small town in which I grew up in southern Wisconsin. I had no idea the possibilities the world included, the people I would meet, the opportunities that would be presented to me. And I had to decide which school would I go to if I was going to college, which path I would follow, if in fact I would go to college, or if I would simply find a job in the factory and stay in my same small town where I grew up. I chose to reach for a school out someplace away from my hometown. The interesting thing about my particular story was that when they said, what do you want to do with your life? And I was trying to figure out something that would relate to where I was or what I was interested in, because that would seem to provide some sort of guidance for, which would be the right decision for me. Well, looking at what I enjoy doing already. Well, throughout my teenage years, I did quite a bit of work with puppetry, building everything from finger puppets to string puppets and two-handed puppets, single-handed puppets, all sorts of things. I could not find any professional puppetry school at that time, so I thought the next closest thing was theater. So I would choose the best theater school at which I was accepted. And so I applied to 2 or 3 different schools. And the curious thing is, it came down to 4 weeks, the beginning of August, before the next school year was to begin. And I still hadn't heard from one school, and I had heard from the other one. So I thought I was going to go to the latter school, but then the former one that I hadn't heard from, I finally called them and said, what's the answer? And they said, what, you haven't gotten your letter yet? You were accepted. And I said, oh, I was. Okay, well, between the two, I chose to go to an acting school in New York City. It seemed to be the better school, more highly regarded professionally, and would put me in touch with more diversity than I'd ever seen in my life, being in the heart of New York City. And it was an incredibly growing experience to be there. Quite an amazing reconnection with the deepest part of me, rather than that part of me I was allowed to see by the small town environment in which I grew up. The interesting thing was, I was at that school a year. I found New York City a little bit overwhelming because I really didn't have a network of friends and or any kind of social organization to support me being there. And my family, of course, couldn't understand why I would go from a town of 10,000 to a city of 10 million. It was kind of amusing in a way, because I would tell everyone in New York what it was like in the town where I grew up, and they would shake their heads in disbelief. How could anybody be that way? And I would go home at Christmas and tell everyone what I thought life in New York City was like, and they would shake their heads in disbelief and wonder how anybody could be that way. And so I was bouncing back and forth between two radically contrasting worlds. And they were both completely real, both existing during the same period of time, just in different places. And somehow it all became part of me being able to see the world in much greater diversity than I never imagined before. The interesting thing was, in choosing to go to that school, the other school, well, I was there for a year. I decided not to continue. I kind of wish now I had, but it's been many years since then, so there's no way to go back, and redo your life all over again. But maybe things turned out the way they were supposed to be anyway. But the interesting thing was, I went to that school for a year, had my experience in New York, felt a little bit overwhelmed by it all because I didn't have anyone really encouraging me to stick it out and press on, and I think I was actually doing better than they let me know, but no one was giving me a lot of feedback about how well I was doing. So I went back to Wisconsin, wasn't quite sure what to do next, wound up in a youth ministry training school for 6 months. That was kind of an intense and fascinating experience. And then after that, someone recommended that I look at a more traditional sort of college. The one I wound up going at was the second choice that I would have gone to 4 years earlier had I not gone to New York City. And so the same school came back into my life, but at a later time. And that's where I went for 4 years and got my Bachelor of Arts in Humanities. But it was very much this complex way that the question word which played out in my life, that in trying to make a decision of which should I choose, the way it played out in my particular life was that ultimately I wound up with both anyway. It was a question, as I thought I was choosing which one would be part of my life. And what, in retrospect, what happened is simply the question of which one comes first, not realizing that both would be there in the bigger picture. In any case, one of the reasons, as we try to wind up this discussion, and of course we've only scratched the surface, one of the reasons to pay careful, respectful attention to the question word which is that any decision I made, any decision I make, any choice I make between two different things, in some sense begins to set a precedent for how I live life from that point on. I can always depart from my precedents and do something new. I have that freedom. But when I make a choice, that the way I make that choice feels more familiar next time I have to make a choice that is in any way similar. So, for example, in choosing to go to New York City for immediately after high school, I was choosing that which seemed to have the most potential, no matter how unfamiliar it might be. That really became a precedent, because when I finally discovered myself to be gay, and it was a discovery, not a choice, the only choice I made was whether to live a life of honesty or whether to live a lie. But when I discovered myself as gay, then the choice became, or the question in my mind was, so what does it mean to be gay? And the opportunity that came up was to become a bodybuilding participant in the 1990 Gay Games, International Gay Games, held in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. And it was by participating in that bodybuilding competition that the whole chain of events that led to becoming Sister Who happened.